Today I'm going to talk about some of the pistachio research that I've been involved with Bruce Lampinen and other UC cooperators and growers up and down the state, really, starting in 2016. And so, why do we need to look into our pistachio pruning methods? Well, I think it's good to think about fundamentally why do we prune pistachios. Pistachios are known for their apical dominance and alternate bearing. And so apical dominance is this vigorous shoot development from the terminal bud. And it's the carbohydrates and hormones that are produced by the growing shoot tip that actually suppress that lateral fruiting bud growth. And so pruning helps with mitigating problems with apical dominance. Another reason is alternate bearing. So crop load fluctuation between years. As Steve was pointing out, we see differences in crop load from one year to the next. And this is because pistachios can have an inability to generate enough carbohydrates for the current season's crops and next year's developing flower buds. And so when there's not adequate carbohydrates, developing buds will abscise and reduce the fruiting potential for the next year. And so conventional training and pruning, the goal is to mitigate that apical dominance and bud abscission with heading, frequent tipping, and thinning to make trees more manageable and productive. But our existing knowledge of pistachio development and its growth habit is really based on growth that results from that conventional training since the first year. Before our research, there wasn't a lot of documentation on just what the natural growth habit of pistachio is. And so I've mentioned some of those cuts, so I'll just make a few distinctions really quick. So when we talk about heading cuts, that's when we're shortening a limb back to a lateral branch to try to force branching to produce long shoots with rapid growth. Thinning cuts are when we remove branches at their point of origin, so to help control tree shape, reduce canopy density, improve light penetration, and limit branches beyond the harvester catch frame. And then tipping cuts, essentially are heading cuts, but when we refer to tipping cuts, we're talking about reducing the length of shoots or whips at the top of the canopy to induce more of that lateral branch development. And so physiologically, what's happening when we do pruning cuts is, so I mentioned that apical dominance earlier and how that is driven by hormonal pathways. So terminal buds, or the apical meristem, as sometimes it's referred to, they produce auxins. And so these auxins inhibit lateral bud growth. Pruning removes that source of auxins and increases growth-promoting cytokinins that actually originate in the roots of trees. So if you look at this from a tree-wide perspective, we call this the auxin-cytokinin pathway that regulates vegetative growth in the tree. So actually, those auxins coming from the terminal bud are actually helping stimulate root growth, and then the cytokinins that are produced in the roots are actually helping with vegetative growth. And so when we remove that source of auxins from those terminal buds, that's what allows the cytokinins to come from the roots and help push that lateral bud growth. So when two buds push out in response to tipping, we often see that they're very close together. And so you do that pruning cut, and oftentimes you get two buds pushing out at the same place. So in mature trees, sometimes we see that this results in bark inclusions. So that center picture there, you can see where there was the initial heading cut that happened. And so oftentimes in mature blocks, you might see bolts, actually holding together the primaries. And so we think that this limb breakage frequently occurs either at that point of the initial heading cut or in-season tipping cut in the second season. So some other pruning approaches like the modified central leader, and I'll describe these different practices in detail. But because that heading cut, that initial heading cut is higher, it allows for more structural branches to break below that initial heading cut. And so we tend to see really strong limb connections in these modified central and unheaded trees. So the objective of our study was to, one, observe the natural growth habit of unheaded, minimally pruned pistachio, just to see, from a pistachio tree from its juvenile years, when it's actively growing, into mature bearing years. Do we see those characteristics of apical dominance? Do we see these characteristics of alternate bearing in a less modified tree structure? And then we wanted to evaluate if reduced or minimal pruning results in a stronger tree structure, earlier production, cleaner harvest, and lower overall cost. So we have a number of trials through the state, all initiated between 2017 and 2019. 2 are in Kings County, one's in Yolo County and Woodland, and then we have one in Fresno County at our Westside Research and Extension Center. We have a few different root stocks that we've been evaluating with different variety combinations, this, spacing ranges from, about a 15 by 18 all the way down to a 13 by 20, a little bit more dense planting at our Westside station. At Westside, we have a combination of, we're looking at both UCB1 seedling and, sorry, that's not PG1, but platinum rootstock with Kerman and Golden Hills. And so at each one of those sites, we have 3 treatments arranged in a random complete block design with 5 replications of 8 trees. So we have the conventional pruning, modified central leader, and then what we call unheaded or unpruned still requires, the minimal pruning to keep branches out of the way of the catch frame. And then another modification is our conventional trees are tied to wooden stakes, wooden grape stakes like you would normally see, but then the modified central leader and the unpruned are attached to metal stakes. The modified central leader is an 8-foot stake, and then the unpruned is a 10-foot stake. And then we use these stretch ties to attach the trees to the stake, and this allows for a little bit more movement than what we see with the grape stakes. And so oftentimes what we see is as the trunks grow with diameter, those stretch ties release themselves because they don't have a metal in the center. And so just to briefly go through some of the distinctions between the different pruning styles. So with conventional, that initial heading cut is usually at about 43 or 44 inches and takes place at the end of the first dormant season when the tree has reached, the young trees reached adequate height. And then in that second in season, so following the first dormant season, when conventional, we're going to develop 2 to 4 primaries and secondary scaffolds by tipping shoots when they reach 12 to 14 inches. And usually you're making that first pass in late May, and then the second in late June, early July. And then in the second and third dormant season, we're going to make sure that our primaries are thinned to 3 to 4 scaffolds, and then we're going to thin the branches on each one of those primaries to 2 to 3 shoots. We're going to head selected shoots back to about 14 inches and remove crossing and low angle branches from the canopy middles. And then in that third following season, we don't do any tertiary branch tipping like we did in the second season, and this is where you mainly are focusing on that rootstock sucker removal. With the modified central leader, so this is a main distinction from the conventional, is that initial heading cut. And so instead of that 43 inches, we're heading at about 62 inches, so almost double the height. And then in that following in-season, the second growing season, we're not doing any of that in-season tipping. And then in the following dormant season, only those low limbs that are too low are removed. Similarly with the unheaded or minimal pruning, we're not doing any heading at all, and we're just removing the limbs that are too low. Okay, so in that second dormant season, we're not selecting primaries with the central leader. We're allowing all of the lateral branches that have emerged to grow. And then we're going to tip the shoots back to 18 to 24 inches from last season's growth. So we're actually cutting them back less than what we would do with the conventional, but because we didn't do any of that in-season tipping in the year before, you're actually cutting off a lot more wood in that second dormant season than you would with the conventional tree, that when you selected for the secondaries and the tertiaries, you may have only gotten maybe 14 to 18 inches of growth, depending on what kind of season it was. And then another distincting factor with the central leader is that we're gonna tip the most central shoot to try to form and train that leader. And then if there's any competing branches that are immediately below it, we're gonna actually thin those out. So we'll remove those completely. Third in season and onward, no tipping and no heading. Oh, this video worked. So you can just see there's an example of a dormant pruning in the second season. Third dormant season, same as the second. The most central shoot is tipped longer than all of their shoots to retrain to a central leader, and then we're going to again remove any of those secondary branches that might be competing with the leader, and then again also cutting back to that 18 to 24 inches. Okay, so at the different research sites, the data collection. I'm mainly going to just go through this for the Woodland or the Yolo County site because, just in interest of time. But we've looked at tree growth in terms of the trunk and scion diameter, shoot growth, tree height at the end of each season, photosynthetically active radiation or PAR. We follow tree water status, and then of course yield. Early on we do hand harvest, and then we've transitioned to mechanical harvest at all the different sites. So this is some growth responses for the Yolo County sites. The top graph shows the rootstock diameter, and then on the right would be the scion circumference, and then on the left is the actual tree height. So what we saw was that in general, and we've seen this at all sites really, with the conventional, we end up seeing smaller rootstocks. And again, you might remember this little diagram I showed early on. To me that says that if we are doing a lot of aggressive heading and tipping early on, that we're potentially suppressing the movement of those auxins to help stimulate root growth. So maybe we're not developing as strong of a root system and corresponding root stock in those conventional trees. And then we tend to see that they're a little bit shorter in the beginning. We haven't really seen much difference in terms of scion growth. In terms of that PAR, it's kind of an interesting story. In general, the unheaded and central leader trees tend to have a larger PAR, but not always significant. And the reason for that is that a lot of times we don't see large differences in actual canopy size in response to these different tree training strategies, because with the conventional, you tend to get a very strong vegetative growth response. So you'll get, these long 1-year-old shoots. which might be comparable in length and size to what we see in the minimally pruned trees, but there's just more complexity in the unheaded and central leader trees because we haven't pruned back that growth. Bruce quite diligently counted a lot of the pruning cuts in the trial in woodland. He counted individual cuts on our replications and extrapolated what that would mean in terms of how many cuts per acre, or in this case for an 80-acre block in the first 8 years. So he calculated that we got over 2.2 million cuts in the conventional, about 1.4 million in the modified central leader, and the untrained, not accounting for those required low cuts, would essentially be zero. And so if you think about this in terms of your pruning costs, it's going to be substantially more for both conventional and the modified central leader training systems. It's probably a conservative estimate because I pulled this from one of the last cost studies that we did, but pruning and training costs in the first 3 years of orchard establishment are more than $450 per acre. And then, as the trees are reaching into their bearing years, conventional pruning, stacking, shredding in those trees, is going to be greater than $278 per acre per year. So, in terms of comparison, that's definitely, you want to factor in your costs, and we haven't even talked about the differences in yield yet. So early on, at several of the sites, we did a lot of cluster counts when the leaves are expanding, but still relatively small. And so that these two graphs are showing 2 years of cluster counts, and we saw much higher counts of flowers, actually, in the unheaded compared to both the central leader and conventional trees that are the green and yellow bars on those two graphs. And correspondingly, at those same sites where we did the cluster counts, we saw similarly much higher yields in the unheaded treatment and the fourth and fifth leaf compared to the central leader, and that trend continued, although at all of the locations really, and I think I do have data for all of those, we saw that by generally about the sixth or seventh leaf, that central leader is really, the cumulative yield is really catching up to the unheaded trees. And similar pattern at our Kings County site. Initially we're seeing higher yields in the unpruned, but then over time, by the seventh leaf, the central leader is meeting that of the unpruned trees. Same thing at our another Kings County site. This site was sort of unique because it's only flood irrigated, and so it tends to be under a lot of stress, and we don't see a lot of growth. But same pattern there in terms of the yields. A lot of questions we get was, okay, well, that's great, but how well do they shake? So we spent a lot of time at several locations. I think this has 3 of the sites here comparing the shaking efficiency, and they don't differ between any of the treatments. So, and the way that we did this was we painstakingly, we would do either the hand or the mechanical harvest, and then we would go back and clean all of the rest of the nuts out of the trees to figure out the proportion that came off in the first shake relative to everything that was on the tree. We saw an interesting pattern in terms of the closed shells and blanks. We tend to see higher levels of those in the conventional trees. So again, thinking back on some of the stress that the pruning can deliver in terms of depleting carbohydrate reserves. Maybe we're taking some of the carbohydrates for filling the nuts, and that may be a reason why we're seeing that trend. So one of our cooperators, Nick Edsall, has continued to do his own analysis, and he recently was looking at his one of his 10th leaf blocks on a 150-acre block in Woodland, and his goal is to assess if heading cuts stimulate renewal growth and improve productivity, or if removal of fruit wood actually reduces yield and profit. And so basically with their analysis, they've looked at trees that only had the low branches that were interfering with harvest removed, and compared that with canopies that were pruned just with a 36-inch length loppers, so just pruning from the ground. So they're not even pruning the higher part of the canopy. And so he feels that a conservative estimate is that they're removing about 15% and maybe more. If you were doing the pruning of the whole canopy, likely you would be removing more than 15% of the crop. And so he calculated that would equal about $4,000 per acre in lost revenue. So what's next for these trees as they reach maturity? Well, generally speaking, we want to make sure to keep trees separate from each other so that we can avoid shaking nuts off adjacent trees. And of course, we want to try to limit alternate bearing at maturity. So even with these modified central leader and unpruned trees, in future research, we're hoping to look at the effects of mechanical pruning. And it will usually be combined with some kind of hand pruning. But we think that the separation among the adjacent trees with unpruned central leader or modified central leader might be easier than conventional. And if cuts are needed, they're likely to be lower on the tree because we have a different architecture. Conventional trees tend to be more round in shape, and the unheaded and central leader tend to have more of a Christmas tree type shape. So if we are removing some wood, it's likely going to be lower in the canopy. So in summary, unheaded trees have larger rootstocks. They are taller trees than the conventional. Larger rootstocks generally result in better growth and resilience in the long term. Unheaded trees had more early fruiting positions and earlier yield potential than both conventional and central leader trees, but the cumulative yields by the 8th leaf are significantly greater for both the unheaded and central leader trees. So the central leader trees do catch up, usually about the 6th or 7th leaf. And then reduced pruning significantly reduces labor costs and improves yield potential and revenue. And with that, I think I have time for a few questions. Hello.
Is the greater yield experienced in the central leader, modified central leader, and unheaded trees simply a function of tree size or increased fruiting efficiency defined as more clusters per unit par?
I know you always ask this question, Bob, and I feel like we tend to have, we do those cluster counts at the beginning of the season. So I think that if we tend to have higher cluster counts, and if that's over a function of par, which is similar between the two, then to me that would tell you that you have more fruit clusters per unit par. What do you think?
I would have to agree with the young trees, where by pruning less, you're driving the young tree into less vigor, therefore, and also having potentially a little greater surface area for photosynthesis. Therefore, by having less vigor, you're inclined to develop more lateral spurs.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, and so when I was alluding to the complexity, that's we tend to see more lateral spurs on the older wood growth. So, going forward, it will be interesting to see, if that, I think that everything we've looked at has been in the juvenile stage of these trees, and now they're reaching full maturity. And so, these type of systems take a long time to evaluate and understand. And hoping to continue research. I'm really kind of intrigued by the research board wanting to look at this from a carbohydrate perspective. So hoping to look at that. Potentially some of those hormonal responses, understand the effects of nutrition. So I feel like there's just so much more to look at. Okay, any more? We
Can you
don't have
repeat
any.
the question, please?
Oh, okay, sure, yeah. So he's wondering how much adoption there is in terms of the system. So we haven't done a formal survey, but I am hoping to initiate some of that this year. But in terms of correspondence, I do know some of the larger agricultural groups have adopted at least the central leader. Some people are going totally unheaded. I'm kind of the opinion that maybe there's with thinking about trying to promote that hormonal balance of the tree, that there may be a benefit to at least some, at least that initial heading cut and some minimal pruning. But sorry to not answer your question, but we do have plans to do wider survey and a more in-depth, detailed economic analysis after reaching out to those people that are adopting it. So hoping to do that this year. Well, I think the only example that we would have of that yet is from our West Side station, where we have the UCB1 seedling and then comparing that with platinum. And so we actually did see, early on quite a bit more growth with the platinum trees. But the yields have actually been significantly lower in those compared to the UCB1 seedling. And so I would say that in terms of a vigor response, doesn't seem to be needed. So to be continued, we'll see how the yields shape up this year. But our platinum trees were really underperforming compared to UCB1 in the unheaded and central leader trees.
Yes. So we are moving on, but yes. Any comments?
Up to 80,000. The Australian industry now up to about 80,000 acres, and 2 new major growers establishing almost that amount of acreage equally has totally adopted the modified central leader, and their trees look just like ours and are very healthy. They're very happy. The industry has totally adopted that system.
Thank you.